When I first moved to the farm, everyone told me to keep an eye on Henry, the neighbor just down the road. He's harmless, they said, but he's got a way about him. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd met him once, a brief handshake at the edge of the property line, and he seemed polite enough, rugged with silver hair and a weathered face that told the story of a lifetime spent working under the sun. He had kind eyes, or so I thought. But that was before I really got to know him, before I understood what they meant. It started innocently enough. He'd come by to help me out with small things, fixing the latch on the chicken coop, sharpening the blades on the tractor. Just being neighborly, he'd say with a warm smile. And I appreciated it, I really did. Running the farm mostly on my own was harder than I'd expected, and Henry seemed to always show up right when I needed him. But then, one evening, something changed. I was out in the barn, wrestling with a broken irrigation pump, cursing under my breath as water sprayed everywhere. My jeans and t-shirt were soaked, my hands trembling with frustration, when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I spun around to see him standing in the doorway, his boots muddy and his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He wasn't smiling this time. His gaze was steady, almost too steady, and it made my heart skip a beat. "I've got it," I said quickly, turning back to the pump, but he didn't leave. Instead, he walked over and knelt beside me, his hands brushing against mine as he reached for the wrench. His touch was warm, rough, and it sent a jolt through me that I tried to ignore. "Looks like you could use some help," he said, his voice low and calm. I didn't argue. I couldn't. We worked in silence for a while, his hands moving with practiced ease as he fixed the pump. I tried to focus on what he was doing, but my mind kept wandering, to the way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the way his forearms flexed as he tightened the bolts, the way his cologne mixed with the faint scent of hay and rain. When the pump finally sputtered back to life, I let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you," I said, standing up and brushing the dirt off my jeans. He stood too, wiping his hands on a rag before tucking it into his back pocket. "Anytime." For a moment, neither of us moved. He was standing so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body, see the tiny beads of sweat on his forehead, and then, before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Why are you always here, Henry?" He raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Because you need me." The air between us felt thick, charged with something I didn't want to name. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I felt my walls start to crumble. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way his voice sounded when he said those words, about the way his hands felt against mine, about the way he looked at me, like he could see right through me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and overthinking things, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, he showed up again. This time, it was to help me repair the fence in the south pasture. I tried to keep my distance, to focus on the work and not on him, but it was impossible. Every time he spoke, every time his hand brushed against mine as we passed tools back and forth, I felt my resolve slipping. And when the fence was finally fixed, and we stood there side by side, looking out over the fields, I felt something shift between us. "You've done a good job with this place," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "Thanks," I said, my throat tight. He turned to look at me then, his eyes soft but intense. "But you don't have to prove anything to anyone, you know. You're allowed to let someone in." I swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and lingering touches. He was always there, always just close enough to make my heart race, but never crossing the line. And yet, the tension between us was undeniable. a constant hum in the background of every conversation, every shared task. I told myself it couldn't happen, that it was wrong. But the more I tried to resist, the harder it became. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine when I heard the knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Henry was standing there, his hat in his hands and a look in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. "Can I come in?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind him. We sat at the table, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. He poured himself a glass of wine, his hands steady as he passed the bottle back to me. "I know what you're thinking," he said finally, his voice low and calm. "No, you don't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I do," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're scared, and I get it. But you don't have to be." His words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You don't know anything about me," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe not," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I know what I see, and I see a woman who's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for far too long. A woman who deserves more than she lets herself have." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. "You should go," I said, my voice barely audible. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, steady, and for a moment, I felt the walls around my heart start to crack. "You don't have to push me away," he said softly. The rest of the night was a blur. I remember the way his voice sounded, low and soothing, as he told me about his life, about the things he'd seen and done. I remember the way his laughter filled the room, chasing away the shadows that had lingered for so long. And I remember the way his hand felt against mine, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the time he left, the sun was starting to rise, casting a soft golden light over the fields. I watched him walk away, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. I knew things couldn't go back to the way they were, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to.